Welcome to Worldbuilding Consultant, a new series on this channel where a generous and brave world builder lets me take a look at their project, where I can be my usual pedantic self, starting out with the world's base assumptions and extrapolating out from there with my own thoughts. For absolute clarity, I have not been paid or in any way coerced into discussing this world. To be honest, I asked Trekeros if I could talk about his project that's currently in a kind of early alpha stage, Flarefall, because I have some thoughts that may be useful to people looking to world build with this game and with the setting that is presented here. So here's how this is going to work. I'm going to hit you with the top level assumptions of this world, as concisely as I can, and then we'll go from there, using my world-building experience, research, prior knowledge, historical understanding, and my understanding of society and its interplay with religion, to add some spice to an already delicious world-building meal. My metaphor may have escaped me. Let's go. The playable world of Flarefall is set 20 years post-apocalypse in 2103. The apocalypse in question? A massive solar flare which overloaded most electronic devices, wherein every single light bulb, power socket, microwave oven, smartphone, hot water tank became an electrical hazard instantly. Outdoors, AI-controlled cars started crashing into buildings, planes fell from the sky, and any exposed power line shot electrical arcing energy for hours. In addition, anyone outside while the sun was visible in the sky was exposed to so much solar radiation that their death was all but guaranteed within months. This was followed by earthquakes, tsunami, volcanic ash release, and a subsequent immediate global cooling and famine, followed a few years later by massive global warming, rising sea levels, unpredictable weather, and the global collapse of infrastructure. In sum, the world is a disaster zone, where the vast majority of electrical devices have failed. Social order is gone, and the very few survivors left are picking through the remains of civilization just to see the next day. In the 60 years between our world and the flare falling, there have been some technological developments very much worth mentioning here. Nuclear fission is discovered and refined into cold fusion, and microreactors are used to power devices on an individual level. Animal experiments have successfully been undertaken to allow them to photosynthesize in preparation for living on other planets. Hard-light technology has also been developed off the back of mastering nuclear fusion, creating a self-reduplicating supermaterial, and much of the world of the 2080s was automated through the use of super AIs which controlled all manner of things from infrastructure to the entire network of self-driving vehicles. Most of this technology only exists post-apocalypse as fragments of its former power, and most of the people remaining would do terrible things to get their hands on a working cold fusion reactor, or indeed an AI-controlled facility that hasn't gone rogue. Thus we have a world of desperate survival in the ruins of a golden age, where survivors fear the sun, and all activity takes place outside due to massive solar radiation, the world of the night sky lit up by auroras which indicate just how much radiation is in the atmosphere. That's the setup. If it sounds cool to you, check out the flarefall.com website or Trekeros' channel, where he's talked in depth about the design philosophy of this game. But there's a few things I really want to touch on in this setting, considering my interest and background in studying society and its interplay with religion and faith. First off, though, who would actually make it through this apocalypse? The flare emerged on September the 8th, 2083 at 9 PM GMT. This makes it evening in Europe and Africa, nighttime across most of Asia, morning in Australia and the Pacific generally, and full-blown daytime across the entire Americas. This is really bad news for some. Due to the deadly nature of exposure to that first flare's solar radiation, we can assume that the majority of the Americas Australia, and the Pacific Islands are pretty well stuffed. It was, after all, daytime. They were out in the sun, and before you say that being inside, being in a building would probably have saved most of them, I'm not convinced. Even if the sun is burning hotter than ever and causing irritation to your skin, your first instinct when faced with a building filled with malfunctioning arcing electronics, and probably the fires caused by those things, is to get out of the building. Evacuation orders in all of these countries will tend towards escaping buildings at ground level, and therefore standing in the sun. When your office building or your home turns into an absolute death trap and every electronic device in there is trying to kill you, the instinct really would be to get out, walking right into the middle-term risk of massive solar radiation exposure, which, as the setting tells us, is deadly. Rural areas may fare better, and less developed areas may fare even better, because I believe that arcing power lines may cause the biggest immediate threat to those who are outside. In countries that have power grids, these are almost always exposed and in the air, attached to every home that needs them. In the areas without immediate direct sunlight, things would still be disastrous, but we would see more survivors. With somewhere between 3 to 12 hours before sunrise in some of these places, and bright aurora lights lighting up the whole area, and the obvious fact of everything going wrong at once, I do find it likely that some well-organised emergency services may be able to organise themselves without the use of technology and get many civilians to a safe-ish bunker before the sun actually emerges over the horizon, before that lovely deadly radiation deadline. Europe will probably come out fairly decently, having the most time to prepare as it's just gone night. And Asia will likely do okay in more densely populated areas where response teams can work faster. Again, depending on how far around the globe you are. But all of these responses would have to be fast and coordinated without technology, which would be tough, and a strain on local resources. Most likely, a state of martial law would be declared in almost every state that becomes aware or has some capacity to do so. The flare massively advantages people who live away from technology, live life off the grid as well, as many of the immediate dangers are not present for them as long as they're inside. But it also really benefits specifically Germans. I mentioned earlier that I believe one of the most immediate dangers to people around the world would be arcing power lines, because if they're arcing enough to reach the ground, humans are often the fastest route if they're standing anywhere nearby, especially if they're, forced to evacuate their homes due to the homes being uninhabitable. Power lines connected to those homes will be problematic. Germany is the only country I can find, at least in our modern world, that has the majority of its power line network buried underground, which will be a massive benefit when it comes to arcing because it goes into the earth directly as opposed to through people. It is also possible, though, that Germany is a bit behind in the 2080s due to its historic refusal to accept any form of nuclear power. This may well extend to the cold fusion development that we discussed earlier. So Germany may, in fact, struggle even with the power lines buried in the ground. As an example, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East have roughly 12 hours to develop some sort of immediate disaster relief and martial law situation before solar radiation comes and shortens the lives of everyone outside by a significant amount. This is not an impossible time frame to ensure that quite a few civilians and quite a few important people are able to be made safe. And don't think that the solo hunter, solitary, off-the-grid lifestyle is perfect either, as most of Earth's current animals are just as vulnerable to solar radiation as we are, barring the photosynthetic test subjects that we discussed earlier. Most diurnal species, in fact, any species that doesn't have a burrow or cave or interior location to live, are basically stuffed and will be also succumbing to radiation sickness very, very quickly. So hunting long-term is not really a viable strategy until these photosynthetic animals begin to proliferate around the world. So to survive 20 years, you're likely going to need to be near some sort of indoor terrace farm, or some sort of terrace farm generally. Probably a lab where these photosynthetic animals can have escaped from and start breeding through the generations and becoming larger and more useful in terms of humans eating them. Have enough supplies to last for 20 years, access to care, healthcare, shelter, resilient plants and arable lands as well. Or some combination of all of the above. The jump from post-scarcity to scarcity is going to be a rough one. You also can't be someone who relies on infrastructure or refrigeration for the delivery of medicines. Be unhoused, or as we discussed, be out in the sun or anywhere near a power line during the first few hours, at least, of this disaster. We are, as Trekero suggests, looking at a return to the Stone Age of isolated small communities trying to eke out survival against a harsh world, with only the memory of society to look back on. So what sort of social structure would all of this create? The World Codex includes a few groups and organisations that have in some way unified and created broader cells across this world. One is trying to solve the crisis by remagnetising Earth's destroyed magnetic poles. There's a group of rail unionists who have turned power brokers, and also their children are kind of nouveau riche. And my favourite organisation, the Collective of Eternal Earth, who use myth and symbolism in an attempt to help future humans, many thousands of years on, rediscover the technology that they remember from 20 years ago, using stories, art, hieroglyphs, and the oral tradition to try and preserve as much knowledge of technology and the advancements that humanity had made before all this went wrong, for a time when humans have made it through and are on the side of rebuilding society. I really like this faction because it does recognise the massive importance of new myth-making in the face of disaster. But I think if we zero in on this, we can take this notion a little further. Firstly, this is, as we've described, an honest-to-goodness apocalypse, and apocalypses breed some very strange behaviour. It's very likely that multiple groups take the flare, no matter how random and bizarre and unmotivated an effect it is, as a sign to confirm their own previously held positions. Especially if they are one of the people who has survived for 20 years, or especially if other members of their community or philosophy have also survived. It's a kind of survivorship bias. We must know why this thing's happened, because otherwise why would we all be here, believing this thing today? Both eco-warriors and climate change deniers would likely take such an event, such a destruction of the world by climate forces, to be confirmation of their positions. Either we deserved this was the consequence of us harming the planet for so long, or the wind farms didn't help us much against a massive solar flare that we had no control over, did it? Furthermore, specific flavours of technological and religious apocalypticism may also find their confirmation in the flare. In modern Protestant Christianity, the notion of rapture is fairly common, wherein God's chosen people are taken up from the earth all at once, which sounds like a mass extinction event to me, with the survivors, the ones left behind, having to repair their faith with God or just being cursed to hell. And with how brutal this would likely be in America, especially in the outset, considering they're in direct sunlight from the moment the solar flare begins, I would anticipate pockets of God's chosen people popping up around that, specifically the North American continent. Perhaps as survivors, or perhaps as guilt-racked survivors, wondering why on earth they got left behind when everyone else was taken up to heaven. Perhaps performing their faith even more passionately and penitently, now that they have not been chosen, trying to treat this as some sort of purgatory to return to God. The thing is, in times of desperation and destruction, new myths, new beliefs, and new ideas proliferate very, very quickly among small groups, and they can be the only thing that people can cling to make sense of mass horrors like this. But the old symbols have power as well. to use some common features in places where we would expect more survivors, churches, mosques, and temples across Europe, Africa, and Asia, they would be critical symbolic spaces and may therefore quickly develop into encampments. In a world of unfamiliarity and novelty, old symbols can grow deep, deep roots as maybe the only thing people recognise from their former life, and these institutions would have incredible symbolic power, therefore. After all, a church, synagogue, temple, or mosque is very likely to have far less smart technology inside it to burn out and destroy things than your average home in 2080. And these structures are also traditionally made out of stone and may have lasted for hundreds of years. Add to that broad social memories of these places being places of refuge and of hope, and I would suggest that these symbols and places of faith may provide an anchoring ground for some of the first communes and enclaves that we might see in this post-apocalyptic world. Another way that the survivor's mindset may be shaped is in the scope of their thought. It is guaranteed by the settings document that most of the people of 2082 had global mindsets, understanding the world as a broad tapestry of nations, peoples, cultures, and companies. However, if we look at modern asylum seekers and refugees, we can clearly see that in times of immense insecurity, people tend to band together within social groups of people with similar protected characteristics as them. In refugee camps, people find solidarity with their fellow countrymen, people of the same faith, or ideally both, or they order themselves by ethnic groups as a simple matter of safety in extremis. Ensuring that your survival companions have something in common is really, really significant for sharing out labour and tasks, and also creating a form of new social order that is universally applied and universally understood as a cultural value. In trying times, people more than ever gravitate towards those that are like themselves, while also gravitating towards charismatic leaders who promise a lot and who offer simple binary pictures of what is right and wrong. Both of these effects are likely to create small sub-societies which treat the other, perhaps even other people, as inherently dangerous, and perhaps even the enemy. Speaking of danger, I also believe that the death of the modern mindset may also lead to a difference in how we perceive space as well. Before widespread mass infrastructure, social mobility, and the broader dissemination of information, the sphere of knowledge of the average human in history was vanishingly small. Most people would know their trade, the local people, and the location of the nearest major settlement, and a few local places of interest, as well as how to get to these places. And their knowledge of anything further afield would rely heavily on travellers, messengers, or stories from further away. This is why we often see early cartography as inaccurate, because it is supposed to be representational of a form of truth. Myth, theology, tales, stories, and things that you might have heard once are all kind of mapped onto a big, broad tapestry of things we know, because a map is a visual representation of the stuff we know about the space we exist within. The knowledge of things like myths and stories is going to be far greater in the average map maker than their specific knowledge of geography or geopolitics throughout most of history. Here be monsters. Well, in this case, yes. Overgrown plants turned red and spiky to absorb the horrific mass solar radiation coming in. Mutant giant ants, meerkats, and badgers able to photosynthesize and roaming the land searching for food. Cannibal communes, rogue AI, collapsing megastructures at every turn. The mythic tapestry of warnings, prohibitions, and stay away would be vibrant in any surviving community, regardless of whether the collective of Eternal Earth is there in presence or not. People love stories, and I know a guy who saw is one of our favourites. I would argue that all of this would lead to a group of insular communities united by similarities. in faith, in ethnicity, or even as ex-Google employees. But not just that. With the scale of the apocalypse at hand, I know a guy who saw becomes I know a guy who died from. And with the mass reliance on technology of the 2080s, these massive hard light megastructures, which likely collapsed immediately, need for personal reactors, reliance on AI for supply chains and transportation networks. Most of these I know a guy who died from stories will start and end with tech, especially from that first exposure to the flare in 2083. Most of the deaths will be directly a result of tech going wrong. The largest, most vibrant and potent cultural touchstone for all survivors will be the mass destruction of people at the hands of technology in these early moments. This, I think, will largely form the basis for a form of neo-mythology in the wasteland, different from settlement to settlement, but broadly similar. The pervading, basic attitude will be a fear of relying too heavily on technology. Yes, it is likely that many groups and some smaller organisations will attempt to recapture and reclaim technology for the sake of humanity or the sake of progress. As we see in the World Codex, we have organisations dedicated to reflipping the geomagnetic state of Earth. But I believe that the memory, the cultural memory of mass destruction just 20 years ago at the hands of technology during this flare is going to become a cultural memory that sticks around and forms the basis of neo-mythology in the wasteland. In many survivors, this is going to likely lead to a kind of neo-Luddite mindset, which may create a massive amount of cognitive dissonance among those very survivors. Yes, all tech is eventually going to flip, betray us all, and you would be a fool to rely on it. Maybe their mantra. All the while, their entire survival over the last 20 years may be predicated on a temperature-controlled bunker/indoor terrace farm. The ability of humans, especially in the throes of extreme situations, to maintain cognitive dissonance is astonishing. Heck, the term cognitive dissonance was coined during study of human responses to failed apocalyptic predictions. But why do I think that our survivors would not extend the same fear, trepidation and concern they may have for technology to the sun? After all, it is a solar flare that causes this whole apocalypse. The trouble is, humans are really quite predictable. It's difficult for most humans to look beyond the first or second order of causes for a thing that they don't like. And it is much, much easier to blame people, systems or technology than to blame a thing like random chance. The sun is the sun, it's impersonal. Whereas a rogue AI that controls Chicago's transit system, causing all of the pods to crash into nearby buildings, toppling down megastructures and killing millions, that is personal. We can blame the coders, the system, the technology itself. These super AI are supposed to be smart. It was an intentional murderous decision. Add to this that it is very likely that our own technologies for detecting solar flares, or indeed detecting adverse weather patterns and asteroid collisions are probably fried at this point, and definitely not able to be converted into mass knowledge around the world. And we have a world where the whims of practical nature are so far beyond the control of humanity that it turns from something that we can predict, understand and prepare for in the modern world of mass weather events that we have some warning over at least, into an impersonal fact of the environment. It is possible that we would see neo-shamanic sun worshippers, or indeed sacrifices for safe weather in certain scavenger communities, and that reading the auroras of the night sky, these are generally predictors of the amount of solar radiation that exists in the world at any one given time, may turn into a form of prophecy or future prediction amongst such communities that believe in this. But I do feel that the blame, and therefore the villains and monsters of myth, will end up being placed not on the environment, not on the sun, but on scientists, global tech companies, and on intelligent technology itself. We may even see some coordinated social movements and cells of neo-Luddites or saboteurs enacting violent extremist terrorism on groups who still use the old world's tech. These could form a part of the collective of Eternal Earth, or in fact be a splinter organisation entirely, more focused on survival using ancient methods than preserving anything that is modern and flawed and capable of betraying us. After all, what's the point in preserving knowledge for future generations? We might not make it that far if we keep relying on the things that killed us. But that's my thoughts on a small segment of the world of Flarefall. Please check out Trekeros's playlist for more information about the world and the game that is being designed alongside it. He's doing a kind of Flarefall February, a big release, and wants as many people to take a look as possible. And take a look at flarefall.com for the custom character builder for the game. Genuinely, not an ad. I just like it. And if you've made it this far, or you think that this series has legs, or you'd think it could work if I made some changes, or even to put your own world building up for some constructive criticism, let me know in the comments. The only way I'm going to be able to keep a series like this, which is a fair chunk of work, going, is if you like it, you watch it, and you share it. That's the reality of YouTube's economics. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. You've just watched Worldbuilding Consultant. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.